Putin were to die in his sleep tonight of a stroke or something like that, all these people would get together and try to figure out who has to be replacing him, who would maintain the status quo. That's all they care about is the status quo.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1281 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to Sir William Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital, head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and author of Red Notice and Freezing Order. That was, I think, back in 2022, April 22, you published that. Sir William, Bill, welcome back to Frontline.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
Now, as we hear more and more of Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil and gas infrastructure, there's unrest, indecision, and contradictory comments coming out of the White House. I think I'm being generous there. Especially when relating to their continued support of Ukraine. Russian fuel prices have jumped 5.7%, I think, in the last month, and shortages are growing. And the front pages of all of the Moscow newspapers today are doing nothing but talking about the fuel crisis. Very few of them mention the fact that Ukraine is attacking the oil refineries, and that's the main problem. They put it down to agricultural pressures at this time of year. And then we get Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov doubling down and wanting Ukraine to give up the whole of the Donbass. Where's this conflict going?
Sadly, I think the conflict is I would say grinding on. I don't think it's going anywhere in any direction, any good direction for the Ukrainians or for us. But at the same time, it's not going in a good direction for Russia. The problem is that the war could end in 24 hours with one simple decision, which is Vladimir Putin deciding that his invasion is over. He's the one who could end the war. The Ukrainians are defending themselves. He's attacking. He's not stopping his attacks. And the Ukrainians have to continue to defend themselves. And so as long as he continues to attack, the war will grind on. And based on everything I know about Vladimir Putin, he has no intention of stopping the attacks. It's not in the Russian psyche to start a fight that they don't finish. And it's not in the Russian psyche to care about the casualties that they're incurring. And so as long as there's no cost to him, and when I say cost, I mean a cost to his power, a threat to his power, the human suffering, the deaths of his soldiers, the economic suffering of his country is immaterial to him. And so he will carry on. The Ukrainians have to continue to defend themselves. And then the war will end in one of two ways. Either the Russians will run out of resources, energy, and ability, or they will take over Ukraine. And we have to do everything possible from our side to provide the Ukrainians with enough weapons and enough economic tools so that the Russians run out of the ability to do this.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin felt emboldened after his trip to Alaska and meeting with Donald Trump, and therefore, if anything, it's elongated the conflict rather than brought it closer to conclusion?
There's no question. Prior to the meeting in Alaska, there was a consensus among Western leaders, including Donald Trump, that a ceasefire was necessary to end the war. And if there wasn't a ceasefire, there would be punishing economic consequences. In particular, there would be the sanctions, secondary sanctions on buyers of Russian oil. So there would be penalties on India, China, Turkey, and other countries who bought Russian oil. And in theory, if those sanctions had been imposed, it could have been absolutely economically devastating for Russia. So the two leaders, Trump and Putin, go to this meeting. And at the end of the meeting, the decision is that there will not be a ceasefire. Our ceasefire is not necessary to end the war. It should just go to a final negotiation. And most importantly, and specifically, there would be none of these punishing secondary oil sanctions. And so from Putin's perspective, on a very practical basis, putting aside all the red carpet and other stuff, he was able to carry on doing what he's doing without punishing sanctions. And from his perspective, that's a huge win because those sanctions could have put him out of business.
But the Ukrainians seem to be imposing their own sanctions on Russian oil. They've restarted. They said they never stopped, but they've restarted their attacks on the Russian oil infrastructure. And even the Druzhba pipeline, which supplied oil into various parts of Europe, has its pumping stations have been destroyed, and we're now seeing queues of traffic trying to get regular gasoline in different parts of Russia. So it's bringing the cause to the Russian people. Do you think the Ukrainian approach to imposing sanctions on Russian oil is something that will work?
Yes, it's working. As you've said, it's working very well. I mean, it's very interesting because Trump has been throwing his weight around trying to get Zelensky and Ukraine to capitulate to Russia. That's how he wants the war. That's always how he had wanted the war to end in 24 hours, was Ukraine to surrender. Ukraine, of course, has no intention of surrendering. And one of the things which he had done before was to link military aid and other types of aid to the requirement of not striking, not using, first of all, U.S. Missiles going into Russian territory, but also not striking the oil infrastructure. And by Trump basically stepping away and saying, I'm not going to do any more military aid, he also loses the ability to limit what the Ukrainians do. And so the Ukrainians have been unbelievably good at this. And as of this morning, they have wiped out 17% of Russia's oil refining capacity. And I suspect that as time goes on, the numbers will continue to go up. Ukraine is really good at this. And not only that, but Ukraine has just put the finishing touches on a new long-range missile called the Flamingo missile.
The Flamingo.
And the Flamingo basically replicates, not perfectly, but replicates a lot of these long-range missiles, the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow missiles that we have been providing from the West, the United States and UK and other countries, in limited quantities. And so now the Ukrainians have, in their own capacity, these Flamingo missiles to go 3,000, I think it's 3,000 kilometers into Russia. And as a result, I think you're going to see all sorts of interesting economic targets being hit. And if the West is not going to impose sanctions, then Ukraine will impose sanctions, and good on them for doing it.
Yeah, 3,000 kilometers and 1,125 kilograms of high explosives. That has a very nasty effect on oil refineries and other bits and pieces. But do you think Putin's actually worried? You know him better than most, and his inner team. What will they be saying? What will they be thinking? What will they be trying to do at the moment?
Well, so Putin puts on a brave face. He pretends everything is fine. He doesn't care. War is going well. He's absolutely panicking back in his bunker about all this stuff, because the only way that he can carry on doing this war is if the Russian people don't turn on him. And it's easy to prevent the people from turning on him if he's got money to slosh around out there. And he's been sloshing it around pretty well, paying soldiers a lot of money, paying the families a lot of money, etc. But if the money dries up, then he's got a problem, because all it takes is one social event, and then he loses control. And that's his biggest fear. He doesn't want 1 million people storming Red Square, because he can kill the leader of an opposition party. He can kill Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, but he can't kill 1 million people and stop an uprising. And so from his perspective, this is deeply worrying. They have got to figure out a way to stop it. At the moment, they have no way of stopping it. And this is a very good tactic, in the same way as when the Ukrainians did this amazing military operation of taking out 1/3 of the long-range bombers in Russia with drones. And so, the Ukrainians are extremely resourceful when it comes to fighting with smaller resources, and thankfully, the Ukrainians are still well supported by the European Union, the UK, Canada, Norway, and many other countries. And so the Ukrainians, are a formidable force, and perhaps at this point, the most capable fighting force in Europe.
Oh, definitely the most capable and the most experienced. And Operation Spider's Web, that drone attack against the strategic bombers, was a masterstroke. And Zelensky clearly knew that he had not just the right cards in his pocket, but he had a full house, as Donald Trump was accusing him of not having any cards. But you mentioned the potential impact on the Russian economy and the Russian people. We're getting reports that indicate that Russia's budget deficit is nearing 5 trillion rubles, and non-military sectors of the economy are stagnating. We're even getting reports of some of the military sectors having difficulty in the manufacturing output because they're not getting paid. Is this getting close to a collapse in the Russian economy? Or do you think this is just a sort of slow, longer-term decline? And how long do you think it is before Putin will get exceptionally worried, or the people will start to rise up?
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near a collapse of the Russian economy, specifically because in addition to the oil refining, which they do, they also export a lot of oil. And the buyers of that exported oil pay, the China, India, Turkey, they pay hundreds of billions of dollars a year to Russia, and that's a lot of money. And so I don't think there's we're even close to a collapse of the Russian economy. But if we were to find some way of preventing them from selling their crude oil, then we would be close to a collapse of the Russian economy. And that could have happened in the days after the Anchorage summit if Trump had not basically capitulated.
But again, the Russians are reportedly dipping into the National Wealth Fund to cover the growing deficit. There must be something at some stage which will sort of, if it doesn't trigger the people, those at the next layer down in the oligarch structure that are supporting Putin will say enough is enough. We're losing too much money here. We need to get back on some form of even keel and get our lifestyles back together again. Are there any indications of that?
No, none whatsoever. And one should have seen that 3.5 years ago. If that was at all a political force, these oligarchs, of course, were the ones that are loving their luxury and their yachts in the south of France and Sardinia and all this kind of stuff. They were immediately banned from those places. And if they were any kind of political force, we would have seen this long time ago. But the fact of the matter is that they're entirely dependent on Putin to be alive, to be wealthy, and to be out of jail. At any point, Putin could end their lives or end their freedom or end their wealth with one stroke of the pen. And so these people, and I've seen that with my own eyes, I've seen how these Russian oligarchs behave. They sort of thump their chest like the most alpha males on steroids until the moment that Putin walks into the room, and then they behave like these subservient little eunuchs. And that is the basis for which Putin has nothing to worry about when it comes to oligarchs. And I think he has more to worry about when it comes to his own people, is if they ever decide they're angry. And that's one of those things that's impossible to predict. It's it's easy for Putin to target individuals. It's not easy for him to suppress an angry nation. And I would argue that part of the reason that he went into Ukraine in the first place was that he's been a dictator for so long and people's lives have not improved for so long that he was worried about people being angry with him. And so he pulled out the Machiavelli playbook and said, how do we prevent, as a dictator, how do I prevent my people from rising up against me? And the answer is to find a foreign enemy and to start a war. And the war with Ukraine is kind of not even a natural war. It's not as if they're natural enemies. I mean, it's more likely, if you're to look at geopolitics and the world, China would be a more natural enemy to Russia than Ukraine. But Putin picked Ukraine because they were easy to fight with and he thought were easy to fight with. It turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, well, I saw a map of the early 20th century of Russia as it was, where the Ukrainian population and those that were speaking Ukrainian and identified as Ukrainians covered large proportions of what is now Russia and elsewhere. So it's interesting to see how it's been spun. But if Putin disappeared, what would the sort of the fight between the next layer seem like to try and replace him? And would there be a danger that in itself could stimulate the collapse of the Russian Federation? Because people in Moscow are there will be a power struggle for someone to try and take over the reins very quickly. And as you said, you've got all these alpha men who will think that they're the one that should be doing it because they know the value that there is in that position.
Well, I think it all comes down to money. If you look at what's happened since Putin came to power in year 2000, he and about 1,000 people around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. So $1,000 billion has been stolen from the Russian state. This money is in their hands and abroad in investments and Russian companies and international companies. And the biggest fear for this group of extremely wealthy and powerful people is if Putin were to die, would the next person then come for all their money? And so, as much as these people are the most unpleasant, aggressive, individualistic people on the planet, they're also the most greedy people on the planet. And I would imagine that if Putin were to die in his sleep tonight of a stroke or something like that, all these people would get together and try to figure out who has to be replacing him, who would maintain the status quo. That's all they care about, is the status quo. And I think it would be very similar to the way that the Pope gets picked. They would all gather in the Kremlin and fight with each other frantically.
A Kremlin conclave.
And then the black smoke would come out of the chimney, or the white smoke, or whatever it is and then that would be, and the new president of Russia would emerge, and that person would be, the main task would be making sure that everybody got to keep the money that they've stolen over the last 25 years.
Yeah, but a lot of the pressure from and a lot of the price that the Russian people are paying for the war in Ukraine is being felt out in the east and the different components of the federation. Are there any indications that there's growing unrest at the casualties, or the cost that it is to communities and all the rest of it? We keep hearing the Moscow line, but we hear very little from elsewhere. Are you picking anything up?
At the moment, no. And so part of the reason is that the people who are the victims of this whole thing have no voice. They're living in a totalitarian dictatorship, and the Russian government is using carrots and sticks. On one hand, if you were to start screaming about your dead son, you would end up perhaps going to jail or losing your job or losing your apartment or whatever. And on the other side, if you keep your mouth shut, then you get $50,000, death fee or whatever the numbers are. And the numbers are quite significant. And for a person living in almost destitution and poverty in some remote part of Russia, that can be a life-changing amount of money. And so you hear these stories about how families are almost sacrificing their young men for their own economic benefit. And so at the moment, you don't hear that kind of anger, which is unusual, because if you look at the numbers, according to Ukrainian estimates, it's about 1.1 million young men have either been killed or maimed. And in any normal democracy, a place where there's any kind of civil society and oxygen for dissent, that would be a catastrophe. Even in the Soviet Union, those numbers would be a catastrophe. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led to something like 15,000 casualties, and that was too much for them. And now we have those numbers in every 10 days. And so Putin has done a very good job of creating absolute fear among his people by basically threatening everybody, and everybody is scared.
But do you think Putin's got to a position now where there are so many casualties, there are going to be so many disabled ex-Russian service personnel, there are going to be so many people with mental health that are running around, and then he's going to have so many people who have not been properly trained as military, but are now trained in how to use weapons and violence and everything else, that he really can't afford not to have a wartime economy and try and get onto a peacetime economy, because that would bring with it so many more problems that he just hasn't got the wherewithal to deal with.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that you don't want to, I think 1.5 million, murderers, armed to the teeth, with huge psychological problems coming back to commit crimes all over Russia. And furthermore, all these factories that are being, running at 100% capacity, fueling the war economy. How do you then, pivot that back towards a regular world, particularly in a world where people aren't going to be buying Russian products in the future because, whether or not there's sanctions, there's still a huge amount of ill will towards Russia for Germany to say, okay, we're now going to become dependent on Russian gas again. I think that's not going to happen anytime in the next 25 years. many other countries as well. And so Putin kind of has to be at war. And I think this is one of the other important things that people need to understand is that it's not just about Ukraine. He has this conquest military because he needs it to stay in power, and he needs it for his economy, and he's not going to stop. If Ukraine were settled tomorrow, he'd probably lick his wounds, rearm, and then make a move on the Baltics, on Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or maybe even Poland. And he needs this, and this is now who he is and what Russia is, and we have to understand that we have not just an enemy at the other side of the border, but an expansionist enemy.
But Russia's being supported, as you said earlier, and it's all being bought by China, India, Turkey, and others. But China's also behind closed doors, providing a lot of technical support and other support. What's in it for China? Why are they doing this?
Well, the main thing that China is doing this for is they love the idea that all of us in liberal democracies with freedoms are suffering, and the authoritarian dictatorship model is in their minds winning, and it helps them if they're trying to dominate the world, and they're trying to do it mostly economically. It helps them if we're spending all this money and we're distracted and running down our resources and using our military weapons and so on. That's just like a gift to China. They're loving that, and they're getting paid for it. So at the same time as we're getting weakened and worn out by this, they're getting all this cheap oil, and so for them it's a great situation. It's a win-win-win all around. The one thing that they don't want to have happen is a nuclear attack, because that then puts them in a particularly awkward position. But status quo, endless wars, that's a win for China for sure.
Well, yes, I think that's why one of the Chinese foreign ministers or staff turned around and said that they did not want Ukraine to win because it kept the West focused on anything but what China was doing in Southeast Asia. But getting back to Donald Trump, why is Donald Trump such a fan of Putin? You described his meeting with Vladimir Putin, I think, as humiliating for Trump. Does Trump realize he's being humiliated, he's being played, and why is he letting this happen?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, he's been from the very beginning, and not even the beginning of this presidency, but going back, he admires Putin. He wants to be like Putin. He wants to have the same powers as Putin. And the Qataris gave him a $400 million jet. Russia's a lot richer country than Qatar. I'm sure he's hoping that Putin will give him something far more valuable. Putin is nothing but goodies for him, and all this stuff about Ukraine where he's got to give them something, that's just something that he doesn't like at all. And so, in his heart of hearts, and this is not like my specific analysis, just look at the body language. Look at how he treated Zelensky in the Oval Office the first time around. Look at all he said just last week, effectively saying, Ukraine shouldn't have started this war. Ukraine didn't start this war. I mean, he's got such a sympathy for Russia and such a disdain for Ukraine that it's hard for him to even cover it up in all this, all this diplomacy. And so that's where he stands. And for us to make, to make any kind of conclusion other than that, and to operate on any assumption other than that, is just going to be costly for Ukraine and costly for our own security in Europe.
Oh, the body language is fascinating. At Alaska, Putin didn't flinch whenever Trump greeted him, and firmly shook his hand and patted him on the elbow. And then the B-2 bomber, flanked by fighters, flew overhead, and they walked past F-22 fighters. Putin just seemed to lap it all in. And then whenever it came to the handshake before the supposed press conference, which was just two statements from Putin and Trump, Trump's body language suggested that he'd been played, and he couldn't quite work out how he'd been played, and he was clearly embarrassed as he shook Putin's hand, and Putin's confidence came across again. But do you think Trump realizes that he's being played, or is he happy to do that? Yes, he supports Putin. He likes what Putin's trying to do, but surely he must be embarrassed.
Well, I mean, he's got so much going on that, like, whatever embarrassment he might have felt in that moment has been overcome by some other new, fight that he's got going on, or some new chaos that he's created, and so it doesn't really matter. I mean, anything that, like, 1,000 things that have happened to Trump would have ruined the career of any other politician, but he's got this absolute ability to just, like, dust himself off and go on to the next scuffle and not care what all the consequences are of those actions and what happened. And I would argue that as far as this Alaska meeting went, I think he was ready to give up on behalf of Europe and on behalf of Ukraine all sorts of things. And the reason that it didn't work out was because Putin didn't want to negotiate at all. Putin didn't want to make any sacrifices at all. And he understood that he couldn't just say, okay, Ukraine should just surrender its entire country and hand itself over to Russia, and that would be the end of the war. That's Putin's position. So Trump was sort of stuck in this thing where he when all the stuff that he wanted to give away wasn't enough even for Vladimir Putin.
Do you think Putin's actively using Donald Trump as something to try and destabilize the coalition of the willing, destabilize Europe, to give Putin more opportunities, therefore, to sow disunity across Europe? And Trump is actually his weapon system, his pawn in doing that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it was by design, but that is how it's turning out. If you look at all these statements from Putin's former partner, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, he's saying America's doing all the right stuff, but it's those pesky Europeans that we have to worry about. And he's hoping that somehow makes the Europeans weaker in their support of Ukraine. But however it happened, it's worked out very well for Vladimir Putin to have this guy in the White House who's sympathetic and effectively wants Russia to have this sphere of influence, and wants Ukraine to give up their sovereignty. And it couldn't have been a bigger bonanza for Vladimir Putin to have this situation as it stands right now.
So, Bill, what's next? There's clearly no peace agreement on the table in any short term. Will Trump walk away? Are we going to be talking about this war this time next year, the year after that, the year after that? What do you see as happening?
Well, what I see happening is that the United States is probably going to stop all support for Ukraine. Europe is going to have to fill in the gap. Europe doesn't have the money to fill in the gap, and so I think we're ultimately going to have to confiscate the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in order to do that. And I think the war will be carrying on until there's a moment when Russia pretty much can't do it anymore. And you have to understand that just because Ukraine is a smaller country with less resources doesn't mean that in any way, shape, or form that they have to lose this war. If you look at what's happened in Afghanistan, both with the Soviets and with the Americans, or what's happened in Vietnam and many other places, people fighting for their own country, for their own sovereignty, even with almost nothing, generally expel the invaders. And in this case with Ukraine, they don't have nothing. They have the support of Europe. And so I think that it's going to be a really hard and painful fight for Putin. And I think he's going to eventually lose, but it's going to go on for a while for sure.
Well, going on for a while for sure. The only positive that comes out of that is we'll get more chance to talk. The horrors on the ground are going to continue, and that's not good for anyone. But Bill, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today for Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.